Muslims often say the Quran confirms the Torah, and that matters. Because if the Quran is confirming the earlier scripture, then when we compare the same stories, we should expect consistency. But when we open the Torah and compare it with the Quran, we find something important. The Quran does not just repeat the Torah. In several places, it tells a different version of the story. So the question is simple. If the Quran confirms the Torah, why do the stories change? The Quran does not present itself as a completely disconnected book. It speaks about Abraham, Moses, Joseph, Pharaoh, and the earlier prophets, and it claims to confirm the previous revelation. In Surah Al-Ma'idah 5:48, the Quran says, "We have revealed to you, O Prophet, this book with the truth, as a confirmation of previous scriptures and a supreme authority on them." So this is not just a Christian question. This is a Quranic question. If the Quran confirms the earlier scriptures, what exactly is it confirming? The names of the prophets? The general themes? Or the actual stories? Because if the stories change, that creates a serious historical problem. And we are not comparing the Quran to something invented after Islam. The Old Testament text existed long before Muhammad. We have Hebrew manuscripts from before Islam, including Dead Sea Scrolls from before and around the time of Jesus. We also have major Greek biblical manuscripts from centuries before Muhammad. So when someone says, the Torah was changed, the question becomes, changed when? Because the Torah we are comparing with the Quran was not created after Muhammad. So let's compare the stories. And the clearest place to start is Joseph. In the Quran, Joseph's brothers throw him into a well. Then they come back to their father Jacob at night, pretending to cry. They claim Joseph was eaten by a wolf. In Surah Yusuf 12:18, they bring Joseph's shirt stained with false blood. But Jacob does not simply accept their story. The Quran records Jacob saying, "No, your souls must have tempted you to do something evil." That is important. In the Quran's version, Jacob sees that something is wrong. He knows his sons are not telling the truth. And later in the same surah, Jacob still speaks with hope about Joseph. In Surah Yusuf 12:87, he tells his sons, "Go and search for Joseph and his brother." So in the Quran, Jacob is not portrayed as a father who fully believes Joseph is dead. He suspects deception. He has hope. He believes there is more to the story. Now compare that with the Torah. In Genesis 37, Joseph's brothers also take his robe and present it to Jacob. But Jacob's response is very different. In Genesis 37:33, Jacob says, "It is my son's robe. Some ferocious animal has devoured him. Joseph has surely been torn to pieces." Then in Genesis 37:35, Jacob says, "I will continue to mourn until I join my son in the grave." So in the Torah, Jacob believes Joseph is dead. That is the emotional weight of the story. His sons deceive him. He accepts the lie, and he mourns Joseph as dead. Jacob suspects deception. So notice the difference. In the Quran, Jacob suspects the brothers are lying. In the Torah, Jacob believes Joseph has been killed. That is not a tiny detail. That changes the emotional center of the story. In the Torah, the tragedy is that Jacob is successfully deceived by his sons. In the Quran, Jacob recognizes that his sons have done something evil. So the question is not, does the Quran mention Joseph? Of course it does. The question is, does the Quran preserve the Torah's story of Joseph? Or does it retell the story in a different form? Those are not the same thing. This is where the problem becomes clear. If the Quran said, "The Torah got this story wrong and I am correcting it," that would be one kind of claim. But that is not how the Quran presents itself. The Quran claims to confirm the previous revelation. So we have to ask, if the Quran confirms the Torah, why does the story not match the Torah? And if the Torah is wrong here, then was the Quran confirming it or correcting it? Those are very different claims. We see another example in the story of Moses. In the Torah, Moses is found by Pharaoh's daughter. Exodus 2:5 says, "Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe. She sees the basket, sends her servant to get it, and later Moses becomes her son." In Exodus 2:10 it says, "She took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son." That is the Torah's account. But in the Quran, the royal figure who pleads for Moses' life is Pharaoh's wife. In Surah Al-Qasas 28:9, the Quran says, Pharaoh's wife said to him, "This baby is a source of joy for me and you. Do not kill him. Perhaps he may be useful to us, or we may adopt him as a son." Now we need to be careful here. The Quran does not say Pharaoh's wife found Moses in the river. But it does shift the royal focus. In Exodus, Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses and takes him as her son. In the Quran, Pharaoh's household picks him up, and Pharaoh's wife is the one who pleads to keep him. Again, this is not the same telling of the story. Someone might say, that is just a small detail. But in historical stories, details matter. The question is not whether both accounts mention Moses. They do. The question is whether the Quran preserves the earlier account as found in the Torah. In the Torah, Moses is adopted by Pharaoh's daughter. In the Quran, Pharaoh's wife becomes the key royal figure arguing for his adoption. So again, we see the same pattern, same prophet, same general setting, different story details. There is another important example with Moses in Midian. In Exodus 2, Moses flees from Egypt, sits by a well, helps the daughters of a Midianite priest, and eventually marries Zipporah. The Quran also tells a version of Moses helping women at a well in Surah Al-Qasas 28. But then the Quran includes a detail that sounds much closer to Jacob's marriage story than to Moses' marriage story in Exodus. In Surah Al-Qasas 28:27, the woman's father says Moses may marry one of his daughters if he serves him for 8 years, or completes 10. But in the Torah, the famous labor for marriage story is not Moses. It is Jacob. In Genesis 29:18, Jacob says, "I'll work for you 7 years in return for your younger daughter Rachel." And Genesis 29:20 says, "So Jacob served 7 years to get Rachel." So the Quran's Moses story contains a detail that sounds much closer to Jacob's story in Genesis than Moses' story in Exodus. I would not overstate this, but it is worth noticing, because now we are not just seeing different wording. We are seeing biblical material retold with details that appear to shift from one story into another. Historically, this fits what we often see in later retellings of biblical stories. The characters remain, the major themes remain, but the details shift. By the 7th century, biblical stories were not only found in the written Torah, they were also circulating through oral traditions, commentaries, and popular retellings. That would explain why the Quran often knows the biblical characters, but tells the stories differently. But that creates a problem for the claim of confirmation. Because if the Quran is confirming the Torah, we should expect the Torah's stories, not shifted details, not blended accounts, not later retellings. The issue is not whether the Quran contains religious stories. The issue is whether those stories match the earlier scripture it claims to confirm. Now the common response is, but the Torah was corrupted. But that answer does not solve the problem. It creates another one. Because if the Torah was corrupted before Muhammad, why does the Quran speak as if it confirms the previous scriptures? And if the Torah was corrupted after Muhammad, that does not explain the differences either, because we have biblical manuscripts from before Muhammad. So the difference between the Quran and the Torah cannot simply be explained as a later Jewish or Christian edit after Islam. The historical problem remains. Some Muslims may respond by saying the Quran is the authority over the previous scriptures. But that still does not remove the question, because if the Quran is needed to decide which parts of the Torah are true, then the Torah is no longer functioning as the confirmed reference. The Quran is. So the practical question remains: what identifiable Torah text is being confirmed? If the answer is only the parts that agree with the Quran, then the claim becomes circular. The Quran confirms the Torah only when the Torah agrees with the Quran. But that is not the same as historically confirming the earlier scripture. That is the tension. So look at the pattern. In Joseph's story, the Quran portrays Jacob as suspecting deception. But in the Torah, Jacob believes Joseph is dead. In Moses' childhood, the Torah says Pharaoh's daughter finds Moses and he becomes her son. But in the Quran, Pharaoh's wife becomes the royal figure pleading to keep him. In Moses' marriage story, the Quran includes a labor for marriage arrangement that sounds much closer to Jacob's story in Genesis. Same prophets, same broad settings, but different details. And these are just a few of thousands of differences. And the more we compare the stories, the harder the confirmation claim becomes. As Christians, we believe God spoke in history. God is not confused. He does not reveal one version of a story through Moses, and then centuries later reveal a different version of that same story. So the question is not whether the Quran mentions biblical prophets. It clearly does. The question is whether the Quran accurately preserves the stories of those prophets as found in the earlier scriptures. And when we compare the texts, the issue becomes difficult to ignore. Same prophets, different stories. So what exactly is the Quran confirming? If the Quran confirms the Torah, why do the stories change? Read it carefully. Read it in context. Then ask yourself, what is the truth? If you're ready to learn, grow, and speak truth in love, join us. Subscribe now. The conversation starts here.